Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The historical trends, case studies, and cultural analyses presented in this video regarding the history of divorce and its literary representations in America are intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. Divorce is a highly complex legal, financial, and deeply personal process that varies drastically depending on your state, your individual circumstances, and the specific nuances of your marital estate. The stories and historical evolutions discussed here do not constitute professional legal advice, financial counseling, or psychological therapy. If you are currently navigating a divorce, marital separation, or family law dispute, it is absolutely critical that you conduct your own due diligence and consult with a licensed family law attorney, a certified financial planner, or a professional therapist in your jurisdiction. Never make monumental life decisions, legal filings, or asset allocations based solely on a historical or cultural analysis found on the internet. We are here to explore the fascinating trajectory of how Americans have documented and consumed stories of marital dissolution, not to guide your personal legal strategy. We currently live in an era where the dissolution of a marriage is not just a personal tragedy or a quiet legal procedure. It is a highly monetized, public spectacle, and for many, a deeply lucrative literary genre. Consider this shocking reality. The modern publishing industry is currently flooded with memoirs, self-help guides, and deeply intimate exposes chronicling the end of marriages, generating millions of dollars in revenue every single year. But this culture of public confession and literary unburdening was not always the norm in the United States. In fact, if you go back just a century, writing openly about your divorce was considered a profound social death sentence. So how did we go from hushed whispers and sealed court documents in the shadows of early American society to massive bestseller lists featuring books that boldly celebrate the end of a marriage? How did the divorce narrative transform from a badge of ultimate shame to the ultimate hero's journey of self-discovery? The answer involves a hidden history of scandalous newspaper wars, rebellious socialites, quiet acts of literary defiance, and a massive cultural rewriting of the American dream. To truly understand the gravity of this shift, we have to look at the first moments in American history where the private pain of marital collapse was thrust into the public eye. In the early to mid-19th century, divorce was exceptionally rare, legally arduous, and universally scandalous. When a marriage ended, the societal expectation was absolute, suffocating silence. The party deemed to be at fault, which was almost always the woman in the eyes of the deeply patriarchal legal system of the time, was expected to vanish into obscurity. Writing about the experience was unthinkable. It would have been viewed as a grotesque compounding of the original sin. But as the Industrial Revolution fundamentally altered the American landscape, bringing widespread urbanization and the explosive rise of the penny press, the public appetite for sensationalism began to voraciously consume private lives. The earliest writings about the divorce journey were not penned by those actually experiencing it. Rather, they were entirely non-consensual narratives crafted by opportunistic journalists. Newspapers began publishing the intricate, deeply personal details of divorce trials, turning the suffering of private citizens into serialized public entertainment. This created a paradoxical culture where everyone was reading about divorce, yet no one was allowed to speak their own truth about it. This deeply oppressive environment set the stage for a silent, brewing rebellion. As we moved into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a radical shift began to occur. We started to see the emergence of thinly veiled fiction, novels where authors channeled their own grueling divorce experiences into the lives of fictional protagonists to bypass the intense social stigma. These early literary pioneers were taking tremendous risks. By translating their trauma into fiction, they were slowly, methodically shifting the Overton window of American culture, testing the waters to see if society was ready to acknowledge the complex realities of incompatible unions. Then came the era of the Reno divorce colonies in the 1920s and 1930s. Wealthy Easterners, desperate to escape the draconian divorce laws of states like New York, flocked to Nevada, where they only had to establish residency for 6 weeks to be granted a legal separation. This mass migration created a bizarre, transient culture of soon-to-be divorced individuals living together in dude ranches and hotels. And from this highly specific, highly pressurized environment, the first modern glimmers of the divorce memoir began to take shape. People began writing letters, columns, and eventually books about their time in the divorce capital of the world, introducing a shocking new tone to the American public. A tone of irreverence, relief, and sometimes even dark humor. This was a profound revolutionary departure from the tear-soaked punitive narratives of the Victorian era. But the true explosion, the monumental shift that directly paved the way for the memoirs that dominate our bookstore shelves today, did not happen until the massive cultural upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s. With the advent of no-fault divorce laws, pioneered first in California in 1969, the legal system finally caught up with the social reality. For the first time, a marriage could be dissolved simply because it was irreparably broken, without the devastating requirement of proving adultery, cruelty, or abandonment in open court. This legal liberation triggered an unprecedented avalanche of personal writing. The floodgates opened. Suddenly, individuals who had felt entirely silenced by the historical narrative were reclaiming their stories. They were no longer the subjects of scandalous newspaper columns. They were the authors of their own destinies. Yet, this newfound freedom to write about the divorce journey brought with it a completely new set of psychological burdens and cultural expectations, creating a powerful, invisible script that modern Americans are still unconsciously following today. And this leads us to the critical question. When you read about divorce today, or when you attempt to process your own relationship transitions, whose narrative are you actually following? Are you navigating your own authentic reality? Or are you simply acting out a cultural script that was written by the publishing industry decades ago? If you do not understand the history of this narrative, you are highly likely to fall victim to its modern illusions. This deeply researched historical masterclass is going to completely deconstruct that invisible script for you. By exploring the cultural history of writing about the divorce journey in America, we are going to provide you with a profound, highly analytical framework to understand how the modern concept of the good divorce or the transformative breakup was artificially engineered over the last century. We will examine critical case studies, tracing the evolution from the scandalous pulp fictions of the 19th century, through the revolutionary feminist memoirs of the 1970s, all the way to the highly curated, aesthetically polished divorce narratives of modern social media. Understanding these historical trends is not just an academic exercise. It is an essential tool for your own emotional and psychological literacy. For the American audience today, navigating the end of a long-term relationship is statistically one of the most common, yet deeply isolating experiences imaginable. You are constantly bombarded by contradictory media messages. One side telling you that divorce is a catastrophic failure, while another highly profitable industry insists that it is the ultimate, glamorous catalyst for a spiritual awakening. This deep dive will solve the massive problem of narrative dissonance that so many Americans face today. By breaking down exactly how these tropes were constructed, brick by literary brick, you will gain the clarity to separate historical fiction from your personal reality. You will learn how the commercialization of the divorce narrative has profoundly skewed our expectations of healing, grief, and recovery. We will show you how authors throughout history have used their writing not just as a reflection of their personal pain, but as highly strategic tools for social survival, financial independence, and the total reinvention of their public identities. We will unpack the specific step-by-step evolution of the vocabulary we use to describe separation, showing you how legal jargon was slowly replaced by therapeutic language and eventually transformed into marketing copy. By the end of this journey, you will possess a sweeping, comprehensive understanding of how American culture has fundamentally commodified the broken heart. This knowledge will equip you with a deeply critical lens, allowing you to consume modern relationship media, self-help books, and cultural commentary with absolute intellectual immunity, fundamentally changing the way you view the intersection of private heartbreak and public storytelling. Let us transport ourselves from the modern conveniences of the year 2026 directly into the suffocating, morally rigid atmosphere of 19th century America. Imagine a man named David, a typical software engineer living in modern Austin, Texas. When David goes through a marital separation today, he has a massive, highly sophisticated ecosystem of emotional and psychological support at his immediate fingertips. He can post a carefully worded, highly curated update on his social media feeds using therapeutic language. He can text his friends from a digital support group, and he can immediately purchase half a dozen highly rated memoirs about surviving heartbreak before his morning coffee gets cold. He fundamentally controls his own narrative. He is the unchallenged author of his own personal transition. Now, imagine completely stripping David of all his modern agency, taking away his platforms, and dropping him into the unforgiving societal structures of Boston in the year 1850. If his marriage failed in that specific historical era, his personal narrative would instantly become the property of the state and the brutal, unforgiving press. The stark historical trend of the 19th century was that the individuals actually experiencing the dissolution of a union were systematically, legally silenced, while the general public greedily consumed their deeply private pain as a form of cheap, serialized entertainment. To truly understand this aggressive dynamic, we must deeply analyze the explosive rise of the penny press and its parasitic, highly profitable relationship with early American family law. Before the mid-1800s, American newspapers were primarily dull, expensive broadsheets focused entirely on complex politics and maritime commerce, completely inaccessible to the average working-class citizen. But when savvy publishers suddenly realized they could print massive quantities of cheap, 1-cent newspapers on a daily basis, they desperately needed sensational, highly emotional content to drive their aggressive street corner circulation wars. They found this incredibly lucrative content sitting right inside the public courtrooms of major cities. Because early American law required absolute, undeniable proof of severe marital fault, such as extreme physical cruelty, criminal abandonment, or proven adultery, the legal proceedings were inherently graphic, highly dramatic, and incredibly invasive to the human soul. Journalists quickly realized that transcribing these raw testimonies provided the absolute perfect salacious material to sell hundreds of thousands of daily papers. Consider the historical case studies of the era, where the most intimate, humiliating, and agonizing details of a failing household were suddenly blasted across the front pages of massive publications like the New York Herald. The investigative reporters would sit like vultures in the packed galleries, frantically scribbling down every single tear, every vicious accusation, and every shattered, desperate defense. They fundamentally transformed ordinary, suffering citizens into two-dimensional, easily digestible characters in a daily real-life soap opera. The American public absolutely devoured these tragic stories. Circulation numbers predictably skyrocketed every single time a prominent family was violently dragged through the legal mud. This morbid fascination created a profound, deeply damaging cultural paradox that fundamentally shaped the psychology of the entire nation. The divorce narrative officially became a massively popular, highly profitable genre of writing in the United States, but it was entirely non-consensual. The husband and wife were completely stripped of their dignity and their voices. They were the tragic victims of the narrative, never the empowered authors. If you were going through a divorce, your primary goal was not to heal, to find yourself, or to seek emotional closure. Your only goal was basic survival and achieving absolute total invisibility. Imagine if the absolute worst moments of your entire life, your deepest personal regrets, your financial failures, and your most private agonizing arguments, were suddenly printed on the front page of every major news outlet in the country, written by a hostile journalist who actively despised you and wanted to make you look as villainous as humanly possible just to drive up their daily revenue. That was the grim, inescapable reality of the 19th century divorce journey. It fostered an environment of intense, pervasive, and suffocating fear. To voluntarily write about your own divorce in this highly toxic climate would have been considered an act of profound social suicide. Women, in particular, faced the most catastrophic potential outcomes imaginable. Under the strict legal doctrine of the time, a woman had virtually no independent legal or financial identity outside of her husband. If she was dragged through a highly publicized divorce trial and the legal fault was successfully pinned on her, she faced total, absolute financial ruin, the complete and permanent loss of custody of her children, and permanent, unforgiving exile from polite society. She would instantly become an untouchable pariah, completely unemployable, utterly destitute, and socially radioactive. Therefore, the very idea of a woman sitting down to pen a memoir, an essay, or a reflection about her emotional journey was legally, biologically, and economically impossible. Complete, absolute silence was the only acceptable currency for the disgraced. Yet, basic human nature dictates that immense psychological pressure eventually, inevitably demands a release valve. As the century slowly progressed and the basic literacy rates among women began to rise dramatically across the country, the agonizing enforced silence surrounding the death of a marriage simply became too heavy to bear. The trauma was incredibly real, the daily isolation was utterly crushing, and the desperate need to connect with others who had suffered similar catastrophic fates grew increasingly urgent. A marginalized demographic of highly intelligent, deeply wounded individuals realized that if they could not speak the absolute truth directly to the public, they would have to learn to speak in a highly sophisticated, deeply hidden code. They needed to find a strategic way to completely hijack the established literary industry and flawlessly bypass the aggressive moral guardians of Victorian America. They obviously could not write non-fiction memoirs without destroying their lives, so they boldly turned to the only cultural weapon available to them. They turned to the subtle art of fiction, specifically focusing on the deeply popular domestic novel, to quietly smuggle their subversive, highly dangerous messages into the quiet drawing rooms of unsuspecting American households. This deliberate, highly calculated shift represents one of the most fascinating and critical historical trends in the entire evolution of American literature. By cleverly cloaking their actual, lived experiences of marital devastation directly behind the protective veneer of entirely fictional characters, these early, incredibly brave authors began to systematically dismantle the massive culture of shame from the inside out. They created elaborate, highly detailed, and emotionally devastating allegories. A tyrannical, abusive husband in grim reality became a brooding, difficult aristocratic lord in a popular novel. The crushing, terrifying financial anxiety of a legally separated woman became the dramatic, highly compelling plot point of an orphaned young heroine desperately trying to survive in a cold, hostile industrial city. They were literally mapping out the treacherous divorce journey step by step, creating a brilliant secret blueprint for emotional and financial survival, but intentionally hiding it directly in plain sight so the harsh literary critics and conservative societal watchdogs would casually dismiss it as mere romantic melodrama. This incredibly brilliant strategy allowed them to finally communicate their profound pain, deeply validate their shared experiences, and quietly reach thousands of other isolated, terrified readers without ever triggering the devastating social consequences of a public, non-fictional confession. But how exactly did these pioneering authors manage to consistently bypass the incredibly strict, highly aggressive publishing censors of the time, who were actively looking to completely crush any narrative that remotely threatened the idealized sanctity of the traditional American family unit? And more importantly, what specific deeply hidden vocabulary did they brilliantly invent during this quiet literary rebellion that modern Americans in the year 2026 are still unknowingly and constantly using today whenever they log online to describe their own modern breakups? The vital answers to these questions lie hidden within a series of highly controversial, almost entirely forgotten novels published right at the turn of the century that completely shattered the quiet, polite rules of American publishing and aggressively forced the entire country to finally look the ugly, unavoidable reality of broken vows directly in the eye. To fully grasp the magnitude of this literary rebellion, we must dissect the incredibly specific, deeply coded vocabulary that was engineered by these turn-of-the-century authors. Because they were legally and socially barred from using the blunt, literal language of marital failure, they essentially had to invent an entirely new dialect of female suffering. When you read the groundbreaking, controversial novels published between 1890 and 1915, you will almost never find the word divorce explicitly used as an empowered choice. Instead, these authors popularized a massive wave of medicalized and environmental metaphors that served as a brilliant smokescreen for marital desperation. A deeply unhappy marriage was never described as toxic or abusive. Instead, the fictional heroine was suddenly afflicted with a severe case of nervous exhaustion, or a mysterious, lingering melancholy that required her to immediately travel abroad for the sake of her fragile constitution. The phrase "taking the cure" became a highly recognizable, universally understood dog whistle among female readers. On the surface, it meant visiting a European sanatorium to rest. But beneath the text, in the quiet, desperate whispers of American reading parlors, it was widely understood to mean escaping a suffocating, legally binding union. Imagine a woman named Jessica, living and working as a real estate agent in modern-day Chicago in the year 2026. If Jessica realizes her marriage is irreparably broken today, she can simply text her friends that she and her partner are experiencing irreconcilable differences, or that they are mutually choosing to consciously uncouple. Society instantly understands and accepts these terms. But if Jessica were transported back to the year 1900 and attempted to publish a story about a woman simply wanting to leave her husband because they were no longer compatible, her manuscript would be instantly rejected, publicly incinerated by moral watchdogs, and she would be branded a dangerous societal threat. Therefore, she would have to write a deeply complex, tragically veiled story where her protagonist mathematically cannot survive unless she is geographically removed from her spouse. This historical trend of medicalizing marital unhappiness was an absolute masterstroke of literary survival. By framing the desire to leave a marriage as a literal matter of life and death, as an unavoidable biological necessity, rather than a selfish, rebellious whim, these authors managed to sneak the concept of marital separation past the incredibly aggressive male gatekeepers of the American publishing industry. Let us look at the fascinating case studies of how these books were actually received by the public. When pioneering authors began publishing these thinly veiled narratives, the critical backlash was absolutely ferocious. Major newspaper critics, influential clergymen, and powerful politicians aggressively condemned these novels as pure poison, claiming they were actively designed to destroy the fundamental moral fabric of the United States. They accused the authors of promoting dangerous hysteria and attempting to corrupt the minds of young, impressionable housewives. But this massive, highly coordinated campaign of public outrage backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. The aggressive censorship inadvertently created the very first massive viral marketing campaigns in American publishing history. The intense controversy generated a profound sense of morbid curiosity among the general public. Women across the country desperately flocked to local bookstores and hidden lending libraries to secretly purchase the exact novels they were being explicitly told to avoid. The authors who dared to write these heavily scrutinized stories were quietly becoming massive financial successes, proving that there was an absolutely massive, completely untapped, and incredibly lucrative market for narratives that acknowledged the dark, complex reality of the American domestic sphere. This financial success fundamentally shifted the power dynamic. Money talks even in the most morally rigid societies. As publishers realized the astronomical profits that could be generated from these controversial domestic dramas, they slowly began to relax their suffocating censorship. The vocabulary began to subtly evolve. By the time we reached the early 1910s, the coded language of nervous exhaustion slowly started to be replaced by slightly more direct psychological terminology. We began to see the very first whispers of phrases like incompatibility of temperament appearing in both literature and the broader cultural conversation. This was a monumental leap forward. It was the first time American culture began to entertain the absolutely radical idea that a marriage could fail not because someone committed a horrific, highly visible crime, but simply because two human beings were fundamentally psychologically unsuited for one another. This psychological framing was deeply threatening to the legal establishment, because the entire legal framework of American marriage at the time relied on proving explicit, malicious fault. If literature convinced the public that a marriage could simply dissolve due to psychological incompatibility, the entire legal foundation of the country would have to be violently overhauled. And that is exactly the pressure cooker environment that pushed the American divorce journey out of the hidden realm of fiction and forcefully into the blinding, chaotic light of real-world geography. The fictional heroines taking the cure in European sanatoriums had served their purpose. They had successfully normalized the idea of escaping a bad union. But in reality, international travel was incredibly expensive and completely inaccessible to the vast majority of suffering Americans. The public desperately needed a domestic solution. A tangible physical place right here in the United States where the fictional fantasies of escape could become a legal reality. They needed a loophole. And in an incredibly bizarre twist of legislative fate, that massive legal loophole was entirely created by a dusty, rough-around-the-edges mining state in the American West that was desperately looking to boost its local economy. Imagine thousands of wealthy, desperate, highly influential individuals simultaneously realizing that the absolute fastest way to rewrite their life story was to board a train, leave everything they knew behind, and temporarily move to the desert. What happened next completely revolutionized the American literary landscape, transforming the deeply private shame of divorce into a highly publicized, incredibly glamorous spectator sport that birthed an entirely new industry of scandalous journalism and celebrity memoirs. Welcome to the Roaring Twenties and the dusty, surreal landscape of Reno, Nevada. To understand this monumental shift in the literary and cultural landscape, we have to look closely at the incredibly unique legal mechanics that created the American divorce colony. In states like New York, the family laws remained completely draconian, demanding public, humiliating proof of adultery or severe physical cruelty, just to secure a basic legal separation. But Nevada, operating on a completely different frontier logic and actively looking for innovative, highly aggressive ways to flood its local desert economy with out-of-state wealth, drastically lowered its residency requirements. By 1931, you only had to live within the state borders for exactly 6 short weeks to be considered a legal resident entitled to a swift, legally binding, and remarkably private separation. This specific legislative loophole created an incredibly bizarre, highly pressurized micro-society. Wealthy Easterners, desperate for legal liberation and social preservation, boarded the Transcontinental Railroad and descended upon small western towns, creating what became famously known as the Reno Cure. They stayed in luxury hotels, sprawling boarding houses, and specialized divorce ranches, which were essentially high-end adult summer camps designed exclusively for individuals waiting out their 6-week legal purgatory. This massive physical migration triggered a fundamental, irreversible transformation in how the American divorce journey was written about, documented, and consumed by the general public. Because these individuals were geographically removed from the suffocating, highly judgmental atmosphere of their hometowns, and because they were suddenly surrounded entirely by hundreds of other prominent people experiencing the exact same transition, the heavy cloak of absolute Victorian shame began to rapidly dissolve into the dry desert air. The legally enforced silence of the 19th century was permanently broken by the clinking of martini glasses, the playing of jazz records, and the steady, relentless clatter of typewriters. People began writing about their failing marriages again, but this time the tone was completely unrecognizable to previous generations. Let us ground this historical evolution in a modern context. Imagine a woman named Rachel, living and working as a senior marketing director in modern-day Manhattan, in the year 2026. If Rachel and her partner mutually decide to end their marriage today, they can literally fill out a series of digital no-fault divorce forms on a secured legal portal from the absolute comfort of their living room couch, completely bypass a physical courtroom, and have the entire dissolution finalized by a judge electronically within a few months. Now, imagine completely stripping Rachel of that incredible modern legal convenience and dropping her directly into the year 1932. To achieve that exact same legal outcome, Rachel would be forced to pack her most expensive clothes, temporarily abandon her entire career and social life, board a train for 3 straight days, and live on a dusty Nevada dude ranch with 40 completely strange women for 42 consecutive days, completely isolated from her normal reality. This intense, surreal isolation acted as a massive psychological pressure cooker, and it produced a wildly new, highly lucrative genre of American literature. We began to see the historical trend of prominent socialites actively writing long letters and diary entries back to the East Coast, but these documents were no longer filled with weeping apologies or deeply coded metaphors about nervous exhaustion. Instead, they were filled with witty, highly cynical observations about local cowboy culture, endless casino nights, and the sheer undeniable absurdity of their shared legal predicament. The writing surrounding the dissolution of a marriage shifted almost overnight from a tone of agonizing, life-ending tragedy to a tone of sophisticated, world-weary adventure. The end of a union was no longer a social death sentence. It was suddenly being written about as a glamorous, highly exclusive rite of passage. We can clearly see this transformation by examining the fascinating case studies of the booming syndicated press during this specific era. Famous writers, glamorous Hollywood actresses, and massive political figures all made the highly publicized pilgrimage to the Nevada desert. And right behind them were the aggressive, newly empowered syndicated gossip columnists of the Walter Winchell era. These savvy journalists realized that the American public was no longer interested in the grim, depressing, morally heavy courtroom testimonies of the past century. The public suddenly craved absolute glamour. They wanted the highly detailed, deeply entertaining specifics of who was staying at which high-end ranch, who was seen drinking at the local speakeasies with the rugged ranch hands, and who was celebrating their newly finalized legal decree by dramatically throwing their gold wedding ring directly into the dark waters of the Truckee River, which became a highly symbolic, widely reported, and intensely written about ritual of the era. This insatiable public demand fundamentally transformed the divorce narrative from a quiet, shameful family secret into a highly lucrative, multi-million-dollar national spectator sport. The writing became incredibly performative. If you were a prominent figure going through the Reno machine, you actively participated in the creation of your own public narrative to protect your brand. You gave highly curated, extensively edited interviews to syndicated columnists, you posed for glamorous, widely distributed photographs on horseback, and you utilized the incredibly powerful national press to signal to the entire world that you were not a tragic, broken victim of a failed marriage, but rather a bold, thoroughly modern individual embarking on an exciting new chapter of personal reinvention. This was the exact historical moment where the concept of the good divorce was first artificially engineered, packaged, and aggressively marketed to the American reading public. However, the language used in these popular articles and early socialite memoirs completely sanitized the profound, underlying psychological devastation of ending a long-term marriage. The incredibly complex, deeply agonizing untangling of a shared family unit was systematically reduced by writers into a snappy, highly entertaining 6-week montage, horseback riding, and cocktail hours. This created a massive, incredibly dangerous historical illusion that continues to haunt our media consumption today. The American public was suddenly reading millions of words about the divorce journey every single week, But they were reading a highly curated, almost entirely fictitious version of the experience that completely erased the deep financial anxiety, the profound loneliness, and the lingering generational trauma that actually accompanied these permanent family separations. This manufactured literary glamour served a highly specific purpose for the wealthy elite, allowing them to gracefully save face and maintain their high social standing in an unforgiving world. But this glamorous, carefree narrative created an absolute psychological nightmare for the rest of the country. What exactly happened to the millions of average, working-class Americans who simply could not afford a luxury 6-week vacation to the Nevada desert to dissolve their toxic marriages? How did this highly exclusive, entirely fabricated literary aesthetic eventually crash directly into the grim, unavoidable reality of the Great Depression and the strict moral resurgence of the post-World War II era? And perhaps most importantly, how did a quiet, seemingly boring change in California family law in the late 1960s completely obliterate this glamorous illusion and unleash the most raw, furious, and highly controversial wave of personal memoir writing in the entire history of the United States? To answer these critical questions, we must examine the intense cultural whiplash that occurred immediately following the Second World War and leading directly into the explosive social revolutions of the late 20th century. The glamorous, highly publicized Reno divorce narratives of the 1930s completely evaporated as the United States entered the rigidly traditional era of the 1950s. Following the extreme global trauma of the war, the American public desperately retreated into a deeply idealized, heavily marketed vision of the pristine nuclear family. The culture of the booming suburbs demanded absolute conformity. The narrative surrounding divorce aggressively shifted backward. It was no longer viewed as a sophisticated high society adventure. It was once again pathologized as a profound, deeply shameful moral and psychological failure. If a marriage was failing in the 1950s, the literary and medical communities did not offer the spouse a glamorous desert escape or a path to personal liberation. Instead, the historical trends of the era show a chilling reliance on clinical psychiatry. Discontent within a marriage, particularly for women, was routinely diagnosed as a severe personality disorder or a fundamental failure to adjust to one's natural biological role. The literature of the time, predominantly written by male psychiatrists and conservative sociologists, completely erased the actual voices of those experiencing marital collapse, replacing their truth with sterile, highly clinical case studies that aggressively shamed anyone who dared to desire a life outside the rigid boundaries of the suburban American dream. This oppressive silence created a massive, unsustainable psychological pressure cooker across the entire nation. Millions of individuals were completely trapped in utterly miserable unions, terrified of the catastrophic social and economic ruin that a public separation would inevitably bring. But this artificial, highly suffocating containment could not last forever. The true monumental rupture in the American divorce narrative arrived quietly in 1969, and it fundamentally altered the literary landscape of the country forever. Governor Ronald Reagan of California signed the Family Law Act, creating the very first comprehensive no-fault divorce system in the Western world. This was an absolute legal earthquake. Mechanically, this meant that a couple could legally dissolve their marriage simply by citing irreconcilable differences. They no longer had to endure the deeply humiliating, incredibly expensive public spectacle of proving adultery, extreme mental cruelty, or physical abandonment in an open courtroom. They did not have to hire hostile investigators or perjure themselves before a judge with highly fabricated stories of abuse just to escape a dead marriage. This drastic change in family law simultaneously collided with the explosive, unstoppable rise of the second-wave feminist movement of the 1970s. This perfect storm of legal liberation and radical social awakening completely obliterated the glamorous illusions of the past and unleashed the most raw, furious, and highly controversial wave of personal memoir writing in the entire history of the United States. Because individuals no longer had to actively invent a false, highly dramatized narrative of extreme fault for the legal system, they were finally entirely free to write about the actual, deeply complex and incredibly nuanced truth of why marriages slowly fall apart. The floodgates of the American publishing industry violently broke open. We witnessed a massive historical trend where the dominant divorce narrative completely transitioned away from heavily coded fiction and highly sanitized gossip columns, moving aggressively into the realm of gritty, uncompromising, and deeply personal nonfiction. Imagine a woman named Sarah, working as a senior financial analyst in modern-day Seattle in the year 2026. If Sarah goes through a marital transition today, she is immediately greeted by a massive, incredibly supportive cultural infrastructure. She can walk into any major bookstore and browse through hundreds of beautifully designed memoirs that actively validate her experience, framing her divorce as a triumphant, deeply necessary journey of spiritual awakening and personal growth. Now, imagine stripping Sarah of that modern literary support system and dropping her directly into the year 1972. The books she would be reading were not packaged as gentle spiritual journeys. They were raw, terrifying survival manuals. The early pioneers of the modern divorce memoir were writing with pure, unadulterated shock and profound rage. They were meticulously documenting the crushing reality of being a displaced homemaker, detailing the severe, terrifying financial inequalities of the era, and exposing the absolute panic of trying to re-enter a hostile corporate workforce after 2 decades of unpaid domestic labor. These authors were not trying to protect their public brands or project, an aura of sophisticated glamour. They were actively weaponizing their personal trauma to expose the systemic, highly institutionalized flaws of the traditional American marriage. This era birthed the modern confessional memoir. Women began forming deeply intimate consciousness-raising groups in living rooms across the country, where the private, deeply held shame of a broken home was spoken aloud, validated, and eventually transcribed into massive, highly influential best-selling anthologies. The fundamental vocabulary of the American breakup completely transformed overnight. We permanently stopped using the tragic, highly medicalized language of the Victorian era, and we completely abandoned the glib, deeply cynical cocktail chatter of the Reno colonies. Instead, the American public began actively utilizing the powerful language of political liberation, psychological trauma, and radical self-actualization. The personal had officially become highly political. Writing about the death of a marriage was no longer seen as a pathetic, isolated personal failure. It was suddenly elevated to a profound, highly intellectual critique of a deeply flawed societal institution. This furious, incredibly raw era of truth-telling permanently destroyed the invisible stigma of divorce, paving the way for millions of everyday Americans to finally reclaim authorship over their own complex domestic lives. However, this fierce, highly authentic period of unvarnished literary rage possessed a fatal vulnerability. The massive publishing conglomerates of the late 20th century quickly realized that this raw feminist energy and deeply emotional vulnerability was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in unprecedented book sales. The corporate publishing industry realized they had stumbled upon an absolute goldmine of human suffering and transition. But pure, unadulterated rage is incredibly difficult to mass market to a broad, mainstream audience over a long period of time. The industry needed a way to package, sterilize, and heavily commercialize this emotional journey. How exactly did the ferocious, politically charged, and deeply intellectual divorce memoirs of the 1970s suddenly mutate into the highly commercialized, pastel-colored, and aggressively cheerful self-help industry that utterly dominates our modern media landscape today? And what specific, highly manipulative marketing tactics did the corporate publishing world actively deploy to successfully convince a deeply vulnerable American public that purchasing a specific book or subscribing to a specific heavily branded recovery methodology would magically cure their profound heartbreak? To understand this massive commercial pivot, we must critically analyze the deeply shifting psychological landscape of the 1980s. The fiery, deeply political revolution of the 1970s was ultimately exhausting for the general populace. As Americans rapidly transitioned into an era defined by intense individualism, corporate deregulation, and hyper-consumerism, their literary and cultural tastes fundamentally transformed. The massive publishing conglomerates of New York quickly recognized a crucial, highly lucrative historical trend. Readers actively experiencing the intense trauma of marital dissolution were no longer looking for an angry political manifesto to burn down traditional patriarchal structures. Instead, they were desperately seeking a customized, highly structured, step-by-step roadmap to rebuild their shattered individual lives. This immense consumer demand directly birthed the modern divorce self-help industry, an entirely new multi-billion-dollar genre of writing that intentionally stripped away the messy, uncomfortable socio-economic realities of family separation and aggressively replaced them with highly marketable, deeply individualized psychological frameworks. The brutal systemic reality of lost pensions, unequal wage gaps, and devastating downward mobility was suddenly rewritten by corporate publishers as a purely personal journey of inner healing and spiritual manifestation. If you were struggling financially or emotionally after a massive legal separation, the new literary narrative bluntly dictated that it was not a failure of society or the family court system, but rather a fundamental failure of your own personal mindset. Let us closely examine the fascinating case studies surrounding the extreme vocabulary shift that occurred on American bookstore shelves between 1979 and 1989. We saw the aggressive, highly calculated introduction of clinical therapy language directly into mainstream commercial publishing. Words and phrases like setting boundaries, overcoming codependency, seeking closure, and cutting out toxic attachments began to heavily saturate the American cultural lexicon. Publishers stopped packaging divorce as a grueling legal battle or a profound societal critique, and began framing it almost exclusively as a deeply spiritual illness that required a highly specific, multi-step psychological recovery process. They created incredibly sticky, heavily branded methodologies. You were no longer just walking into a store and purchasing a single book about a breakup. You were buying into a comprehensive, deeply immersive lifestyle system. These sophisticated self-help systems almost always included companion workbooks, daily affirmation journals, incredibly costly weekend healing seminars, and expensive audiocassette programs, all specifically designed to guide the vulnerable reader through a predictable, highly standardized emotional arc. This was a stroke of absolute marketing genius by the publishing world. By intentionally framing the chaotic, deeply unpredictable pain of a divorce as a temporary psychological condition with a clear, step-by-step cure, the publishing industry successfully created a massive recurring revenue model constructed entirely out of human heartbreak. Imagine a man named Michael, working as a senior architect and living in modern-day Denver in the year 2026. When Michael searches the internet for resources to survive his current, highly contentious marital separation, the digital algorithm instantly bombards him with targeted advertisements for online masterclasses, highly stylized healing journals, and expensive personal coaching sessions, all offering potential outcomes of absolute spiritual renewal and total emotional freedom. He is actively participating in an incredibly refined, highly digitized version of the exact same consumer funnel that was initially built by publishers in the 1980s. Now imagine taking Michael back to 1985 and placing him directly in the self-help aisle of a sprawling suburban shopping mall bookstore. He would be looking at the exact same foundational architectural blueprint of recovery. The paperback books surrounding him would forcefully tell him that his profound grief is merely a necessary transitional phase, a highly exciting opportunity for radical self-improvement and total personal reinvention. The implicit message woven into these texts is incredibly seductive and deeply, quintessentially American. You can literally purchase your way out of profound emotional agony if you simply buy the correct book, rigorously follow the proprietary steps, and maintain a relentlessly, exhaustingly positive attitude. However, this highly commercialized historical trend carried a deeply insidious and widely unacknowledged psychological side effect. By aggressively packaging the divorce journey as a mandatory opportunity for ultimate personal growth, the publishing industry inadvertently created a massive, suffocating cultural pressure on the individual to perform their emotional recovery flawlessly. If you analyze the best-selling self-help literature of the 1990s, the texts present potential outcomes that are almost universally triumphant and aesthetically beautiful. The literary protagonist always emerges from the absolute ashes of their marriage significantly stronger, infinitely wealthier, and deeply, profoundly enlightened. But what exactly happens to the millions of average, working-class Americans whose lived experiences do not fit neatly into this highly polished, fiercely optimistic narrative architecture? What happens when the grief becomes chronic, the financial devastation is permanent and inescapable, and the heavily promised spiritual awakening completely fails to materialize despite filling out hundreds of pages in a branded recovery workbook? The self-help industry inherently and quietly blames the consumer. If you are not actively thriving post-divorce, the pervasive literature heavily implies that you simply did not do the psychological work correctly. You did not journal consistently enough, you failed to properly process your toxic attachments, or you stubbornly held onto your anger instead of graciously letting it go. This intense cultural gaslighting leads us directly to the creation of one of the most powerful, highly demanding, and enduring literary archetypes of the late 20th century, the concept of the good divorce. Prominent writers, clinical psychologists, and celebrity commentators began churning out endless, highly repetitive volumes dictating exactly how modern couples should separate with maximum public grace and absolutely zero collateral emotional damage. The literature provided strict, highly prescriptive rules for how to calmly speak to your ex-spouse, how to logically divide massive financial assets without displaying an ounce of human anger, and how to seamlessly co-parent as if the entire emotional foundation of the family had not just been entirely detonated. This created an incredibly high-stakes, utterly exhausting societal standard of emotional regulation. The American public was essentially being trained by paperback books to completely suppress their authentic rage, betrayal, and devastating sorrow in order to successfully perform the highly coveted role of the perfectly evolved, spiritually healed divorcee. It became a bizarre, deeply competitive cultural contest to see who could care the least, collaborate the best, and move on the fastest, often culminating in the bizarre historical trend of people throwing elaborate, highly catered divorce parties to publicly prove to their social circles just how incredibly unbothered they were by the collapse of their vows. But raw, authentic human emotion is inherently chaotic, deeply unpredictable, and it absolutely refuses to be neatly contained by pastel-colored paperback workbooks or rigid self-help methodologies. As American society rapidly approached the dawn of the new millennium, a radical, deeply disruptive new communication technology was quietly being developed that would completely and permanently dismantle the centralized, highly sanitized authority of the corporate publishing industry. The carefully curated, highly sterilized narratives of the self-help era were about to collide violently with an unfiltered, highly democratic, and deeply chaotic new form of massive public storytelling. Suddenly, ordinary suffering Americans would no longer need a literary agent, a PhD, or a massive publishing deal to broadcast their private domestic warfare to millions of complete strangers across the globe. How exactly did the invention of the early internet blog and the massive, unstoppable explosion of early digital forums completely revolutionize the American divorce narrative once again? And what terrifying, unprecedented new psychological consequences emerged when the private agony of marital collapse was suddenly subjected to the instantaneous, deeply unforgiving judgment of the modern digital public square? The transition into the early 2000s marked the most violent democratization of the written word in human history, fundamentally shattering the massive, centralized authority of the traditional publishing conglomerates. Up until the invention of the personal weblog and the early internet message board, the American divorce narrative was entirely controlled by a rigid hierarchy of professional gatekeepers. If you wanted to share your story with the public, you had to successfully pitch a literary agent, secure approval from a corporate editorial board, and mold your profound personal tragedy into a highly marketable, sanitized product that neatly fit the pre-existing psychological templates of the era. But the sudden, unstoppable proliferation of early blogging platforms completely obliterated that barrier to entry overnight. Suddenly, anyone with a dial-up internet connection and a keyboard could instantly bypass the massive publishing houses and broadcast their raw, unedited, and highly volatile emotional state to a global audience in real time. The cultural history of writing about the divorce journey was no longer being drafted by clinical psychologists or wealthy socialites. It was actively being written by millions of average, working-class Americans sitting alone in the glow of their computer monitors at 2 in the morning. Imagine a man named Thomas, working as a regional logistics manager, and living in modern-day Atlanta in the year 2026. If Thomas decides to write about his ongoing marital separation today, he is operating within a highly sophisticated, algorithmic digital landscape that actively encourages him to curate his words carefully, perhaps drafting a thoughtful, highly sanitized post for his professional network, or sharing a beautifully formatted aesthetic graphic about co-parenting boundaries. He intuitively understands the massive, permanent risks of the modern digital footprint. Now, completely strip Thomas of that modern digital literacy and drop him directly into the chaotic, untamed Wild West of the internet in the year 2003. The historical trends of this specific era show a public that had absolutely no concept of digital permanence. The early internet felt incredibly intimate, deceptively private, and largely anonymous. This massive illusion of safety encouraged a level of extreme, unfiltered oversharing that the American public had never before witnessed. People began publishing thousands of words every single day, documenting the agonizing, granular details of their legal battles, transcribing verbatim arguments with their soon-to-be ex-spouses, and posting the exact financial figures of their bitter alimony disputes for absolute strangers to consume and analyze. Let us closely examine the fascinating case studies of the massive, highly tribal divorce forums that dominated the early digital landscape. These rudimentary, text-heavy message boards created intense, highly radicalized echo chambers that completely revolutionized the vocabulary of American family separation. We saw the organic, grassroots invention of a highly specific, aggressively militarized digital slang. The sanitized, therapeutic language of the 1990s, which heavily focused on inner healing and spiritual closure, was aggressively replaced by a completely new lexicon of digital warfare. Spouses were permanently reduced to crude acronyms, legal strategies were openly crowdsourced by thousands of anonymous commenters, and the entire excruciating process of dismantling a family unit was essentially gamified for audience entertainment. If a writer posted a deeply furious update about a perceived injustice in family court, the immediate, overwhelming validation they received from hundreds of anonymous commenters provided a massive, highly addictive hit of dopamine. This completely altered the psychological mechanics of the divorce journey. Writing was no longer a reflective tool used strictly for after-the-fact processing and healing. It had violently morphed into a highly reactive, real-time weapon deployed actively in the middle of the legal battlefield. This introduces one of the most dangerous and unprecedented potential outcomes of the early digital era: the destruction of the historical processing gap. For the entirety of American history, the act of writing about a divorce occurred significantly after the actual event had concluded. Authors had years to process their grief, gain necessary emotional distance, and carefully craft a narrative with the benefit of hindsight. The internet completely eradicated that crucial buffer zone. People were now writing about their profound heartbreak exactly as it was happening, actively seeking immediate counsel from a highly biased, deeply anonymous public square. The real-time feedback loop created a terrifying psychological phenomenon where the audience actually began to influence and heavily dictate the real-world actions of the author. If a writer expressed a fleeting moment of empathy or a desire to compromise with their spouse, the aggressive digital echo chamber would rapidly accuse them of weakness, actively pressuring them to adopt a much more hostile, uncompromising legal strategy to satisfy the bloodlust of the forum. The deeply private, highly nuanced reality of the marital collapse was being actively manipulated and forcefully rewritten by the demands of the digital audience. Furthermore, as the first decade of the new millennium progressed, a massive shift occurred in the basic economics of personal storytelling. The completely anonymous, highly text-based forums slowly began to be replaced by beautifully designed, heavily branded, and fully public-facing personal blogs. Everyday Americans quickly realized that their ongoing domestic tragedies could be highly lucrative. We witnessed the sudden historical trend of the monetized digital confessional. Bloggers began placing aggressive banner advertisements, affiliate links, and highly profitable Google display ads directly alongside their most agonizing, tear-stained posts about infidelity and custody battles. This created a deeply perverse financial incentive structure. The more dramatic, chaotic, and legally contentious the divorce journey became, the more web traffic the blog generated, which directly resulted in significantly higher monthly advertising revenue for the author. Everyday individuals were accidentally transforming themselves into highly incentivized tabloid journalists, exclusively reporting on the absolute worst moments of their own lives for daily clicks and digital ad revenue. This aggressive monetization of raw human suffering fundamentally broke the traditional American divorce narrative, turning private citizens into deeply compromised public performers. The audience demanded an endless, highly entertaining supply of conflict, and the authors, now financially dependent on their readership, were heavily incentivized to continuously escalate the drama rather than actually seeking quiet, boring, and fundamentally unmarketable emotional resolution. But the dense, highly intellectual, text-heavy era of the written blog was completely unsustainable. As broadband internet speeds aggressively increased, and a revolutionary piece of glass and metal called the smartphone was suddenly placed into the pockets of millions of Americans, the fundamental architecture of the internet experienced another massive, civilization-altering earthquake. The deeply complex, written paragraphs of the blogosphere were about to be forcefully violently replaced by the instantaneous, highly addictive, and aggressively curated visual aesthetics of the social media feed. How exactly did the American divorce narrative survive the massive transition from the written word to the heavily filtered photograph? And what happens to the human psyche when the deeply agonizing, fundamentally ugly process of legally dismantling a family is suddenly forced to conform to the relentless, visually flawless, and aggressively positive algorithm of the modern Instagram aesthetic? To fully comprehend the massive psychological whiplash of the early 21st century, we must understand that the smartphone revolution fundamentally rewired the human brain to process trauma entirely through a visual lens. The text-heavy blog of the early 2000s allowed for the ugly, sprawling, entirely contradictory nature of human grief. You could sit down and write 5,000 furiously angry words about a highly contested custody dispute, and the internet would absorb it. But the modern social media algorithm, specifically platforms designed entirely around the square photograph and the short-form aesthetic video, explicitly and mathematically punishes that level of complex, unvarnished negativity. The modern algorithm runs entirely on visual pleasure, relentless aspiration, and rapid, frictionless engagement. Therefore, the deeply agonizing, fundamentally ugly process of legally dismantling a family had to be immediately, forcefully sanitized and aggressively repackaged as a highly curated visual aesthetic. We can clearly trace this monumental shift by looking at the specific historical trends surrounding the modern divorce announcement. Historically, a divorce was announced through a dry, strictly factual, two-line legal notice printed in the back of a local newspaper, or through hushed, deeply uncomfortable phone calls to immediate family members. But as we entered the visual era of the 2000s and 10s, the end of a marriage was suddenly transformed into a highly produced piece of digital marketing. Major celebrities and wealthy lifestyle influencers established a rigid, entirely inescapable visual template that the rest of the country was expected to follow. This template almost always involved a beautifully lit, slightly faded, highly romanticized photograph of the couple, perhaps walking away on a sunset beach or holding hands one last time. This photograph was always accompanied by a lengthy, heavily edited, PR-scrubbed caption explicitly detailing their profound mutual respect, their unwavering commitment to friendship, and their deeply enlightened decision to consciously uncouple. The American public, highly susceptible to these polished, incredibly wealthy case studies, immediately began mimicking this exact behavior. Suddenly, everyday citizens were actively staging elaborate, beautifully lit photo shoots specifically to announce the death of their marriages to their extended network of high school acquaintances and former co-workers. This created a massive, utterly suffocating cultural pressure to visually perform a completely harmonious separation. You were no longer allowed to simply be angry, betrayed, or financially devastated in the public square. You were strictly socially obligated to project an image of supreme enlightened peace. The good divorce of the 1990s had successfully transformed into the beautiful divorce, a hollow, highly performative visual facade that entirely prioritized the aesthetic comfort of the digital audience over the actual emotional survival of the individuals involved. Imagine a woman named Chloe, working as a senior project manager, and living in modern-day Miami in the year 2026. Chloe is currently enduring a brutal, highly contentious legal mediation over hidden financial assets, and behind closed doors, she is experiencing profound insomnia, deep financial panic, and terrifying anxiety. But when Chloe opens her modern social media applications, she fundamentally knows she cannot post a raw, tear-stained photo of herself surrounded by aggressive legal paperwork. The unspoken algorithmic rules of the modern digital square dictate that she must actively participate in the highly publicized aesthetic of the post-divorce glow-up. To successfully prove to her digital audience that she is surviving this transition, Chloe feels immense, daily pressure to post carefully filtered images of herself attending an expensive morning Pilates class, drinking aesthetically pleasing green juices, or standing on a beautiful mountaintop looking pensively into the horizon. If she fails to provide this constant visual proof of her thriving, beautifully curated post-divorce life, the digital society will rapidly deem her bitter, stuck, and fundamentally broken. This relentless demand for visual perfection created incredibly dangerous potential outcomes for the American psyche. It essentially forced the clinical self-help methodologies of the 1980s to drastically mutate and merge directly with the modern multi-billion-dollar wellness industrial complex. Healing from a massive family rupture was no longer just a private, psychological process of attending therapy. It became an incredibly expensive, highly aestheticized physical transformation that required constant digital documentation. The algorithms aggressively pushed the narrative that true emotional recovery could only be validated by external, physical beauty and hyper-consumerism. If your marriage ended, you were algorithmically encouraged and heavily targeted to buy a completely new wardrobe, book a deeply aesthetic, highly photogenic spiritual retreat to a foreign country, and document every single expensive step of your physical transformation for public consumption and validation. The corporate landscape quickly realized the massive monetization potential of this specific, highly vulnerable demographic. Brands began specifically targeting newly single individuals not with practical legal services or financial planning, but with highly priced wellness supplements, aesthetic home decor meant to energetically cleanse the marital home, and luxury fitness subscriptions. The deeply painful, highly isolating experience of dismantling a life and starting over was successfully and aggressively rebranded as the ultimate luxurious act of personal self-care. This specific historical trend systematically and ruthlessly erased the working-class reality of the American divorce. If you were a single parent working two exhausting jobs just to afford basic rent after a devastating financial split, your gritty, deeply unglamorous survival simply did not fit the visual parameters of the grid. Therefore, your authentic experience was rendered completely invisible in the modern cultural narrative, completely replaced by wealthy influencers selling crystal healing and post-marital fitness routines. We artificially created a massive culture of toxic digital positivity, where the profound, jagged edges of human heartbreak were forcefully sanded down to fit perfectly into a brightly lit photograph. People were performing their emotional recovery so aggressively for the internet that they were completely neglecting the actual messy, deeply uncomfortable psychological work required to heal behind closed doors. They were entirely focused on winning the visual breakup, but maintaining a flawless visual facade requires an immense, entirely unsustainable amount of daily psychological labor. And as the digital era rapidly matured, the perfect, highly curated grids of the early visual landscape began to severely crack under the immense pressure of actual lived reality. A radical new wave of digital platforms emerged, aggressively prioritizing raw, highly reactive, and unfiltered video content over static, polished photography. The pendulum of American storytelling was about to swing violently back from the silent, aesthetic photograph to the chaotic, highly reactive video confessional. And lurking right behind this massive technological shift was a deeply profound, completely unavoidable demographic time bomb. What exactly happened when the very first generation of children, whose entire childhoods and parents' highly publicized aesthetic divorces had been meticulously documented and monetized online without their consent, finally grew up, created their own digital accounts, and furiously began to reclaim their stolen family narratives? The answer to that massive looming demographic time bomb exploded across our modern screens not through carefully edited photographs or heavily ghostwritten paperback memoirs, but through the highly raw, fiercely reactive, and totally unvarnished medium of the front-facing camera. We are currently witnessing an unprecedented historical trend that is completely rewriting the sociological fabric of the United States. The very first generation of digital natives, the children whose parents actively utilized early social media platforms to publicly broadcast their enlightened, highly aesthetic marital separations, have officially reached adulthood. And they are absolutely undeniably furious. For the past 20 years, the American cultural history of the divorce journey was strictly and exclusively authored by the adults in the room. The parents held the ultimate power of the pen, they completely controlled the camera angle, and they actively collected the massive digital advertising revenue. The children were merely silent, non-consenting props, routinely utilized to visually prove to the digital public that the family was successfully and gracefully surviving the monumental transition. But the sudden invention and total cultural dominance of hyper-viral, short-form video algorithms entirely inverted this massive power dynamic overnight. Imagine a young man named Ethan, currently a college sophomore living in modern-day Chicago in the year 2026. Back in 2014, when Ethan was just 8 years old, his parents went through a highly publicized, deeply monetized digital separation. His mother ran a massively successful lifestyle and wellness blog, and she meticulously documented the entire divorce as a beautiful, seamless spiritual journey. She consistently posted perfectly lit, highly edited photographs of the fractured family sharing amicable Sunday brunches, actively selling her massive audience the profound, heavily marketed illusion of the perfect, conflict-free conscious uncoupling. Ethan was forcefully instructed to smile in hundreds of these photographs while silently enduring the agonizing, deeply chaotic behind-the-scenes reality of vicious screaming matches, bitter legal custody handovers, and profound, completely unaddressed emotional neglect. The internet heavily praised his parents for their incredible emotional maturity, while completely ignoring the profound psychological damage being inflicted on the child trapped directly inside the digital performance. Today, Ethan does not need to write a traditional book, pitch a literary agent, or secure a massive publishing deal to completely expose this massive generational deception. He simply picks up his smartphone, stares directly into the camera lens from his dimly lit, perfectly ordinary dormitory room, and records a highly raw, entirely unedited 3-minute video aggressively dismantling his mother's lucrative, heavily curated public narrative. He explicitly tells his millions of new viewers the absolute, unvarnished truth. The aesthetic Sunday brunches were entirely staged for lucrative corporate brand sponsorships. The so-called amicable separation completely destroyed his childhood mental health, and the relentless public performance of the good divorce was nothing more than a highly toxic, deeply manipulative financial strategy. The modern algorithm instantly and heavily rewards this raw, unfiltered rage, pushing his deeply personal counter-narrative to millions of highly engaged viewers across the globe within a matter of hours. The silent prop has suddenly and violently become the undisputed author of the story, completely reclaiming the historical truth of his own fractured family. This is not an isolated, singular incident. It actively represents a massive civilization-altering shift in American public storytelling. We are currently observing incredible, highly complex case studies where the adult children of the aesthetic divorce era are actively and aggressively unionizing their shared trauma online. They are utilizing the immense algorithmic power of modern short-form video to brutally drag the American divorce narrative out of the pastel-colored wellness industry and throw it aggressively back into the gritty, highly uncomfortable, and deeply unpredictable realm of raw human reality. The fundamental vocabulary of the breakup has violently shifted yet again. These young adults are completely rejecting the sterile clinical therapy speak utilized by their parents in the 1990s and 2000s. They are absolutely not interested in politely discussing boundaries or seeking spiritual closure. Instead, they are actively utilizing the highly potent language of digital exploitation, forced consent, and profound generational trauma. They deliberately record their videos without professional lighting or carefully curated backgrounds, utilizing the visual aesthetic of the anti-aesthetic to actively rebel against the suffocating perfectionism of the previous decade. This aggressive, highly coordinated reclamation of the narrative has permanently and fundamentally shattered the massive cultural illusion of the beautiful divorce. The massive corporate publishing industry and the highly lucrative digital wellness influencers who spent the last 3 full decades attempting to sell the deeply vulnerable American public the idea that a massive family rupture could be a seamless, highly aesthetic, and perfectly healed experience are suddenly facing intense, undeniable, and highly critical public scrutiny. The new generation is aggressively pointing out a terrifying, mathematically inescapable psychological reality. When parents actively invest massive amounts of their limited emotional energy into publicly performing a highly curated, visually flawless separation for the absolute approval of complete strangers on the internet, they inherently have significantly less emotional energy available to actually parent their deeply grieving children in the private, unlit shadows of their own homes. The intense public performance of healing actively prevents the actual private work of recovery. This unprecedented digital rebellion has triggered a massive, highly uncomfortable cultural reckoning among American adults, fundamentally altering the legal landscape of family separation. For the absolute first time in over a century, the individuals actively going through a marital separation are suddenly terrified to publicly write about it. The modern parents of the year 2026 are acutely, painfully aware that their digital footprint is completely permanent, and that their children will eventually possess the absolute technological power to publicly fact-check their emotional narratives in real time. We are now seeing the incredible historical trend of family law attorneys actively writing strict digital gag orders into standard custody agreements, legally preventing parents from posting about the divorce journey on social media to protect the children from future algorithmic harm. This brings the American legal system full circle from the terrifying days of the 19th century penny press, where the courts are once again deeply involved in managing the public dissemination of private family trauma. The highly performative, deeply commercialized divorce announcement that utterly dominated the last decade is rapidly becoming completely socially radioactive. If you actively choose to post a beautifully lit photograph celebrating the end of your marriage today, the modern internet will aggressively judge you, heavily criticizing you for prioritizing your personal digital brand over your children's fundamental right to strict psychological privacy during a massive family crisis. The digital square is actively closing its doors to the aesthetic divorce. This intense cultural backlash leads us directly into an incredibly profound, highly terrifying cultural vacuum. Over the course of this deep dive, we have watched American society systematically dismantle the oppressive Victorian silence. We outgrew the cynical, highly glamorous Reno gossip columns. We successfully commercialized the furious feminist rage of the 1970s into highly structured paperback self-help, and we have just watched the children of the digital age completely destroy the beautiful, visual aesthetic of the modern social media era. Every single historical framework we have ever utilized to publicly write about, monetize, and process the American divorce journey has officially collapsed under its own massive psychological weight. So what exactly happens now? Where do suffering, highly isolated Americans actually go to process the absolute most devastating emotional transitions of their entire lives, when the public digital square has become too incredibly dangerous to navigate, and the massive publishing conglomerates no longer hold the definitive answers? Are we aggressively reverting back to the total suffocating historical silence of the 19th century? Or is a revolutionary, entirely hidden new underground network currently being built right beneath our digital screens? We are absolutely not returning to the suffocating, legally enforced silence of the Victorian era. The fundamental human compulsion to process profound, life-altering grief through the structural architecture of language is biologically hardwired into our psychology, and it simply cannot be legislated away by family court judges or algorithmically shamed out of existence by a massive cultural backlash. Instead, what we are actively witnessing across the United States right now is the rapid, highly sophisticated construction of a massive, entirely hidden underground network of digital processing. Historical trends have consistently and relentlessly shown us that whenever a public square becomes too dangerous, too heavily monitored, or too aggressively commodified, human beings instinctively retreat to the margins to build protective speakeasies. Today, the new speakeasies of the American divorce journey are being quietly engineered right beneath the incredibly volatile surface of the mainstream internet. Everyday citizens are violently rejecting the hyper-public, algorithmically punishing platforms of the past decade. They have watched the catastrophic social fallout experienced by the influencer class. They have heard the furious, undeniable outrage of the digital native generation, and they are pivoting their behavior completely. We are tracking a massive, unprecedented migration away from public-facing timelines and directly into deeply encrypted messaging applications, heavily gated, invite-only server communities, and completely anonymous, decentralized web structures. People are actively utilizing ephemeral text protocols, engineering their highly sensitive messages to automatically and permanently self-destruct immediately after being read by a trusted peer, completely obliterating the terrifying civilization-ending threat of the permanent digital footprint. Imagine a man named David, working as a regional logistics director and living in modern-day Columbus, Ohio in the year 2026. David is currently navigating the deeply agonizing, legally treacherous early stages of a high-conflict marital separation involving significant marital assets. If David were experiencing this exact same transition just 10 years ago, the dominant cultural script would have heavily pressured him to post a highly sanitized, aesthetically pleasing update on his public social feed, inevitably inviting a massive flood of completely unhelpful, highly performative public sympathy from casual acquaintances. But today, David makes a fundamentally, radically different choice. Recognizing the extreme legal and psychological liabilities of the modern digital landscape, he entirely locks down his public profiles. He goes completely dark. Instead, he utilizes a secure authentication protocol to join a heavily vetted, profoundly anonymous digital support server specifically engineered for middle-aged professionals currently entrenched in family court battles. Within this highly secure, technologically sealed digital vault, David is absolutely not performing his grief for corporate brand sponsorships, and he is fiercely protecting his children from any future algorithmic harm. He is finally free to write incredibly raw, highly detailed paragraphs about his deepest financial terrors, his profound custody anxieties, and the excruciating daily reality of dismantling a 15-year partnership. But he is doing so within a tightly sealed, heavily monitored community of digital peers who strictly enforce absolute operational security and deeply understand the undeniable necessity of mutual, impenetrable silence. This entirely hidden network is rapidly generating a completely new, highly evolved literary framework for the American breakup. The vocabulary inside these encrypted spaces is incredibly utilitarian, highly tactical, and brutally honest. We are observing the absolute, irreversible death of the performative therapy speak that completely dominated the early 2000s. The dangerous historical trend of treating a legal divorce as a glamorous spiritual wellness retreat has been thoroughly dismantled and aggressively replaced by a gritty, incredibly practical focus on fundamental emotional survival, strategic financial restructuring, and the aggressive, non-negotiable protection of the family's total psychological privacy. In these hidden digital rooms, the ultimate, highly coveted sign of a successful divorce is no longer defined by how beautifully you can photograph your healing journey on a foreign beach, or how flawlessly you can execute an amicable Sunday brunch with your ex-spouse. Rather, the highest mark of success is defined by how quietly, respectfully, and efficiently you can dismantle the legal union without leaving a single traceable piece of collateral digital damage behind. The new, ultimate American ideal is the completely invisible divorce. When we take a monumental step back and critically analyze this sweeping, deeply complex cultural history of writing about the divorce journey in America, we uncover an incredibly profound, undeniable psychological truth about the fundamental nature of the American public. For over 150 years, we have desperately, relentlessly utilized the written word to actively negotiate the incredibly fragile, highly volatile boundary between private domestic heartbreak and public morality. We began our journey in the incredibly oppressive, deeply humiliating courtrooms of the 19th century, where our personal voices were completely stolen from us and weaponized by the sensationalist, highly predatory penny press monopolies. We survived that era by cleverly and brilliantly smuggling our profound pain into the highly coded, heavily fictionalized domestic novels of the Victorian era, utilizing medical metaphors to slowly hack the cultural mainframe from the inside out. We then briefly and enthusiastically chased the glamorous, deeply cynical, and heavily alcohol-soaked illusions of the Nevada desert colonies in the 1930s, intentionally transforming our quiet shame into a highly lucrative, syndicated national spectator sport. Following the suffocating psychiatric containment of the post-war era, we forcefully shattered the suburban silence with the raw, uncompromising, and highly intellectual political fury of the 1970s feminist memoirs. But our raw truth was incredibly valuable, and we tragically allowed our profound grief to be heavily packaged, aggressively sterilized, and sold directly back to us by the massive corporate self-help publishing conglomerates of the 1980s and 90s. We then foolishly attempted to take those clinical methodologies and visually filter our profound devastation for the ruthless, visually demanding algorithms of the early social media age, artificially creating a deeply toxic culture of flawless digital positivity that ultimately broke the psychological backs of an entire generation. Through every single one of these massive, violently disruptive historical eras, the underlying human objective has remained exactly fundamentally the same. It is the desperate, relentless human attempt to reclaim absolute authorship over the most chaotic, deeply terrifying, and profoundly isolating disruption of the adult life. The monumental shift we are experiencing right now in the year 2026, this massive silent exodus into the encrypted, heavily protected digital shadows, is simply the latest, most highly evolved chapter in this endless, deeply American survival story. We have finally, after a century of public trial and error, learned the incredibly painful, unavoidable lesson that our private suffering does not inherently belong to the state apparatus, it does not belong to the predatory publishing conglomerates, and it absolutely, unequivocally does not belong to the voracious, unforgiving digital algorithm. By meticulously understanding this massive, deeply complex historical timeline, you are now equipped with the ultimate, impenetrable intellectual immunity. When you walk into a modern bookstore, or when you scroll through your daily digital feeds, you will no longer be easily manipulated by the heavily branded, incredibly lucrative illusions of the breakup industry. You can finally step completely outside the highly manufactured cultural script that dictates exactly how you should feel, grieve, and publicly recover. You can actively reject the immense, suffocating societal pressure to constantly perform your emotional healing for the approval of complete strangers. You now possess the profound historical clarity to understand that the most powerful, truly transformative, and deeply authentic way to write about your own personal survival might just be the quietest way possible. The true, absolute masterclass of navigating the modern divorce journey is arriving at the ultimate realization that the only audience who ever actually mattered, and the only reader who can truly validate your profound emotional transition, was the one looking directly back at you in the mirror.